Okay. So, and then I'm going to share my screen to show Mike's PowerPoint. And then Mike, it's all up to you. There we go.
Okay. I'm on now, am I?
Yep.
Cool. Mamihi atu kia koutou I roto ia ihu karaiti. Greetings in Christ to all of you as we gather on this Sunday morning. And yeah, I use that word advisedly. We are gathering, even though we're not gathering physically. It's great to be able, as Nicola said, to see each other and together. I think we could move on from the PowerPoint now. Is that okay?
Yep.
And a couple of things about this morning's sermon. The first is, if by chance you want to see me and not everybody, and I understand that you may not want to do that, but if you want to be able to focus on the speaker, if you go up to the right of your screen and press speaker view, that will work for you. And the other thing is, if and when my words cut out because of internet failure, just make up your own until I come back in, okay? What do you think of when you hear the word giant? What comes to mind immediately? Something pretty monstrous, something terrifying, something huge and gross. There are a couple of well-known stories in the Bible about giants, but actually these biblical giants are not all that enormous. They're not the giants of our imaginations. They're not the giants of movies or fairy tales. The giants of the Bible are really just larger than normal human beings. And I want to read to you one of those biblical giant stories now. It's 1 Samuel 17. I'm not going to read the whole chapter because it's a long story, but I'm going to read some excerpts which give a good overview of that story of a particular giant in the Old Testament. So here we go. The context for the story is that the armies of Israel and the Philistines, their arch enemies, have gathered to fight a war, and they're gathered on the two facing mountain ranges or ranges of hills with a valley in between, and they're facing each other across the valley. And verse 4 of 1 Samuel 17 says, Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead weighing 15 pounds. His armor bearer walked ahead of him, carrying a shield. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. Why are you all coming out to fight, he called. I am the Philistine champion. You are only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me. When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. Down to verse 16. For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. And then David enters the picture. We're told that David is a young man whose brothers are in the Israelite army, and he's sent by Jesse, his father, to take his brothers some provisions. I guess the army food wasn't great, and also to find out how they were getting on. So in verse 20, we're told, David arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. And then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. David asks some soldiers, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he's allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" Down to verse 31, then David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. "Don't worry about this Philistine," David told Saul. "I'll go fight him." "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth." But David persisted. "I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats," he said. "When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I've done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the claws of the lion and the bear will deliver me from this Philistine." And so eventually David gets approval to go and fight against Goliath. Initially, he puts on Saul's armor, but it's way too heavy and he can hardly move. So without any armor, he goes off to fight Goliath. And in verse 39, we read, "So David picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Goliath walked out toward David and his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. 'Am I a dog,' he roared at David, 'that you come at me with a stick?' And he cursed David by the names of his gods. 'Come over here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals,' Goliath yelled. David replied to the Philistine, 'You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And then the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us.' As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone. Then he ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath and used it to kill him and cut off his head. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they turned and ran." So I've got a question for each of us today, and in fact for every day. How big are your giants? How big are your giants? We're told in this story that Goliath was over 9 feet tall. That's about 2.75 meters for those of you who are not familiar with the old numbers. Actually, there's some debate about how the measurements given in the original Hebrew text, just how they translate into our measurements. And it could be that Goliath was anything from 6.5 feet to 9.5 feet. Even if we go with the biggest of those possibilities, 9.5 feet, 2.89 meters, that's pretty big. And the average height in those days was thought to be about 5'6". So yeah, Goliath was pretty big. But it's not the sort of big that we tend to think of if we imagine a giant. It's not the kind of big that can't be killed with a sword and a spear. Goliath was a very big human being. The difference between David and all the rest of the Israelites was how he looked at his giant. Here's what we're told about the perspective of the Israelite soldiers. The Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. You know, they're all excited, they're feeling strong and tough. They're going out to beat these Philistines, leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. The very next thing we're told about the army is, as soon as they saw the Israelite army saw Goliath, they began to run away in fright. The shouts and battle cries turned to terror, and they ran. That was their perspective of the giant Goliath. He was too big. They couldn't handle him. There was nothing they could do. Here's what we're told about David's perspective as he looked at Goliath. The Lord who delivered me from the claws of the lion and the bear will deliver me from this Philistine, for he has defied the armies of the living God. See, David and the Israelite soldiers, they're all looking at the same giant, at the same person, the same 9.5-foot man. But what they see is quite different. They're looking at the same thing, but they've got a different perspective. So again, the question, how big really are your giants? Based on what he's seen God do in the past, based on what he's experienced of God's ability, David is confident of God's protection, God's provision, God's power. David looks at the giant Goliath with the eyes of faith in God. And through those eyes, Goliath doesn't look so big. The Israelite soldiers, their confidence is in themselves and in each other. And so it won't stand up in front of even a very large human being. The same thing's true in the Old Testament's other well-known giant story, recorded in Numbers 13. 12 spies go to check out the land that God has promised to his people, a land flowing with milk and honey, the promised land. And they all agree that's what it is. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. It's a great land. This would be a wonderful land to settle in. But 10 returned saying, we saw giants there. There's no hope for us. We can't take that land because we saw giants there. And in fact, they probably exaggerate the size of the giants that they saw. But the other two, Caleb and Joshua, say, let's go at once to take this land. We can certainly conquer it. All 12 saw exactly the same thing, but they saw it through different eyes. How big? Really, how big are your giants? How big are they? What eyes are you looking at them through? The eyes of genuine faith in a God who has protected and provided for you in the past, or the eyes of self-confidence, self-reliance? It all depends on me, which crumbles in the face of anything that looks remotely like a giant. Now, some of you I know are facing real giants. Giants regarding your health situation, giants regarding family and relationships, giants of finances and employment, and COVID and this lockdown and all the associated challenges and fears. They can seem like a giant as well. And I don't want to belittle those things that you may be facing and struggling with. But it's also true that sometimes as we face these challenges, we let them get bigger than they really are. We let them become giants in our perspective, in our thinking, when actually they're not that gigantic at all. Often they're the sorts of things my kids refer to as first world problems. Nobody's going to die because of this. It's not life-threatening. But they assume great proportions in our thinking. They become giants in our eyes. Let me just share a very little recent example for me. As we went into lockdown 4 weeks ago, the immediate thought that came into my head and which started to dominate my thinking was, how can I possibly be involved in leading a church on the other side of the city from where I live during this lockdown time? I'm so far away from everybody. I won't be able to go and meet with anybody. Now, of course, the reality was it's no more difficult to pastor a church on the other side of the city during lockdown than it is to pastor a church down the road during lockdown. In either case, you can't meet with anybody, you can't gather for worship, etc. But it just kind of felt more of an issue for me until I got my perspective right. I was allowing it to become larger than it was. I had to get my perspective right and look at it correctly. So how do we do that? How do we make sure we keep our giants in perspective? Well, actually, the answer is the same as the answer to pretty much every other question relating to how to live as followers of Jesus. If you want an answer for every question about living as a follower of Jesus, certainly it's the answer to this one. It's faith. That's the answer. David trusted God, even in the face of Goliath. Joshua and Caleb trusted God, even in the face of the giants that they saw in this land that God had promised his people. They trusted God because they'd seen throughout their lives to that point that God was trustworthy. Listen to David's words. The Lord who delivered me from the claws of the lion and the bear will deliver me from this Philistine. I know God's protection. I know he's been with me in all of these other situations. So why should I doubt that he'll be with me here and that he is able to defeat this giant? When you're looking at a giant, whatever your giant is, you've got to look at it through the eyes of faith. Faith in a God you have found to be faithful. Sometimes as a church community, you can face challenges together that feel gigantic as well. And maybe even as church community, sometimes we allow things to become much bigger, much more gigantic than they actually are in reality. And you could say that Eastview Baptist has recently been through a challenging experience, a difficult corporate experience together with the decision needing to be made about the call of a pastor and differences of opinion about that. We can allow that to become much bigger than it really is. Or we can trust the God who has provided for and watched over Eastview since its very beginning. Many of you have been part of this church for a long time. You know that God has been faithful, that God has provided, that God has looked after you throughout whatever situation the church faced. Trust the God who has provided and watched over this church right since its beginning. Note these words from the story of David and Goliath. David replied to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And then David says, "Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head." It reminds me of what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, partnership and participation, partnering with God in what he's doing and then participating with him in that work. The Lord will conquer you. I will kill you and cut off your head. That's the way to face your giants. Look at them through the eyes of faith in God and then get on with doing your part to overcome them. And then again, the words of David, the whole world will know that there is a God, and everyone will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. So we're going to go into breakout rooms now, and by the wonders of technology and the skill of Nicola, you're all going to end up in different little groups. I've got no idea how that works, but that's going to happen. I want to encourage you to share briefly with each other. I'm not sure how many will be in each group, but share briefly a situation either from your own life or maybe something you look back on from the history of Eastview Baptist Church, something that maybe seemed to start with like a scary giant, but actually you found God was trustworthy. I want this to be faith building. I'd love you to hear a number of stories in each of your groups. So that requires two things. Firstly, it requires that a lot of people will share something. Secondly, it requires that you don't speak for too long. Maybe 30 to 60 seconds, just the bones of the story that will build others' faith as you remember, yes, God has been faithful. And may the Lord build our faith this morning and enable us to see our giants through the eyes of faith. Thank you.